Good afternoon and welcome to EntryPoint, where we take a deep dive into the latest entries from Encyclopedia Virginia with the contributors who wrote them. I'm Patti Miller, managing editor of Encyclopedia Virginia, and I'm pleased to be hosting today's program about the Ethiopian Regiment and the early revolution in Virginia. In case you're not aware of Encyclopedia Virginia, EV is a free, reliable multimedia resource that tells the inclusive story of Virginia for anyone seeking to understand how the past informs the present and the future. You can access the entries we're discussing today and all our entries at encyclopediavirginia.org. Andrew, can you hear us?
Yeah, hi, Patty. How are you?
Hi, Andrew. There you are. Awesome. Okay. Anyway, welcome to EntryPoint, everyone. As I said, I'm really excited to have today's guest with us today, Andrew Lawler. Andrew is the author of our newest entry on the Ethiopian Regiment. Andrew is a contributing writer for Science Magazine and a contributing editor for Archaeology Magazine, as well as the author of 3 books, including The Secret Token, Myth Obsession, and The Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke. His latest book, which we're going to be talking about today, is A Perfect Frenzy, a royal governor, his Black allies, and the crisis that spurred the American Revolution. The New York Times book review called Perfect Frenzy a perfect frenzy, a sharp-eyed look at the messy, sometimes absurd, often cruel birth pangs of a nation. It prompts readers to question the simplistic narratives that have shaped our understanding of this pivotal period in American history. We at Encyclopedia Virginia are all about complicating narratives, so we're thrilled to have Andrew with us today to talk about his book and the Ethiopian Regiment. We will have some time to ask Andrew questions, so please share your questions using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and I'll get to those after Andrew finishes telling us about his fascinating new book. And I'll also be dropping links in the chat about our new entry on the Ethiopian Regiment and other entries we talk about along the way, so you can check those out later. So Andrew, the floor is yours. Please take it away and tell us about Lord Dunmore and his Ethiopian Regiment and this fascinating period in American history.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Patty. It's a pleasure to be here. I hear you're having a snowstorm there in Charlottesville, so hope everybody's off the roads. So let's talk about Virginia at the onset of the American Revolution. To do that, I'd like to show you a little PowerPoint, which I will share. And you bear with me. Okay, there we go. Everybody can see it, I hope. So a little bit about the background. So the book I wrote came out of my kind of curiosity about the villain of my childhood, and that was Lord Dunmore. So who was Lord Dunmore? Because he was the last royal governor of Virginia. You probably are all aware of that. And when I was growing up, he really was considered a villain. He was said to have burned my hometown of Norfolk, Virginia. He was said to have used black men as cannon fodder during the Revolution, and then basically he was backing the wrong horse. He was backing the British government rather than the victorious patriots. So I stumbled on some kind of contradictions to these ideas a few years back, and when I went down the rabbit hole, I really went down for several years and have just come back with this book. So first of all, John Murray was a Scottish Highlander from the Murray clan. He was also, it's very interesting to note, a son of a rebel. If any of you have seen the series Outlander, you probably are familiar with the Bonnie Prince Charlie rebellion against King George II in 1745. Dunmore's father and Dunmore himself were actually part of that rebellion. They actually were in the court of Bonnie Prince Charlie and trying to overthrow these, what were seen as German kings and replace them with proper British kings. Now, this failed, but this effort definitely shaped the way Lord Dunmore saw rebellion. And of course, he ended up as the governor of what was the largest, most populous, most influential province in British North America. But first, he went on, he joined the British Army when he was young. He became a member of the House of Lords when he was made an earl on his father's death. And he's also very interesting in that he was a very well-educated person. In fact, he was part of the Scottish Enlightenment in Edinburgh. He was friends with Adam Smith. He knew David Hume. He really was in the thick of this intellectual ferment happening in Edinburgh in the 1760s. He went on, of course, to be named governor of New York, actually, because he needed a job. He was a rather poor aristocrat, and he needed a paying job. His wife's sister married a British minister, and thereby he was able to secure this job in New York. Very quickly, though, the Governor Botetourt died, and the king directed Dunmore to go to Virginia instead, where he promptly became one of the gentry. He became a person who owned land, owned enslaved people, and he was so settled in Virginia that he even brought his wife, Lady Dunmore, and their six of their children to Virginia in 1774. Kind of bad timing, but at the time, it seemed like a good idea. So let's talk a little bit about Dunmore's Virginia. As I mentioned, Virginia was, of course, the oldest, largest, wealthiest, and the most populous colony. You could basically put all of New England in to Virginia and still have plenty of room left over. So this was primarily an economy where tobacco planters, both large and small, oversaw forced labor camps. In fact, your average Virginia planter only owned a handful, maybe even just one or two enslaved Africans. But this is really what the basis of the economy and the social structure was then. There are 4 out of 10 Virginians were enslaved. So, it was nearly half the population who were living in lifetime servitude. Now, one thing that's interesting that plays into our story a little bit later is that Scottish merchants, rather than Virginians, English Virginians, were the ones who were taking the tobacco to Britain. And they also were bringing goods to Virginia. So they had an immense amount of power, and they were becoming increasingly influential economically by the 1770s. Now, the thing about tobacco is it uses up the soil quickly, so you got to move west to get new land. So there was a great push in Virginia this time for people to move west, and not just small farmers, but also people like George Washington, who wanted to own large tracts of land on the other side of the Appalachians. This had been forbidden by the king, and I won't go into the details since it's more tangential to our discussion, but it's just worth keeping in mind that while people in New England were worried about tea and taxes, people in Virginia, the elite at least, were primarily concerned about getting this Western land. And I'll just mention parenthetically that Virginians, white Virginians, were already very nervous by the beginning of the Revolution because an English court had freed an enslaved Virginian taken to London in 1772. And his name was James Somerset, and his emancipation really upset a lot of white Virginians who feared the British would do the same in Virginia. Now, things were going pretty smoothly for Dunmore until March of 1775, when Patrick Henry, 250 years from next month, famously gave his big speech, "Give me liberty, give me death." The conservative planters narrowly agreed to form a militia, but keep in mind that their goal was not to create a new nation, but it was actually to go back to the way things were back before the French and Indian War, a time when Britain was viewed as taking a more hands-off approach to the colonies. Now, Dunmore had to act at that point. He had this incipient rebellion on his hands, so he secretly one night had Marines take the gunpowder that was stored in Williamsburg's arsenal out and had it put on a British ship in the James River. Now, this, of course, infuriated the Patriots, and people gathered, and Dunmore, when he was threatened the following day, declared that he would free the slaves and burn Williamsburg to the ground if he were attacked. Now, this is a very practical response, given that he had very, very few soldiers at that point. He basically was defenseless. He had his family in the palace. So this was clearly a short-term effort to try and stop the Patriots from committing violence against him, his family, and the few British officers and soldiers who were there in Williamsburg. Now, his decision to threaten that he would free the slaves had an enormous impact. Why? Well, James Madison himself said that we shall fall like Achilles by the hand of one that knows the secret. The secret being that Virginia was filled with enslaved people who wanted their liberty and were likely to fight for that liberty if offered the opportunity. So his decision, Dunmore's decision to free the slaves, or to threaten to free the slaves, angered not only people in Virginia, but up and down the East Coast, including in South Carolina, where essentially he was accused of undermining the very basis of government, which was to protect white citizens from their enslaved people. Landon Carter, a Virginia planter who always was forthright in what he said, he said, slaves are devils, and to make them otherwise than slaves will be to set devils free. So gives you a sense of the fear that white Virginians constantly lived with, this concern that not only would slaves escape, and you can see Thomas Jefferson's runaway slave ad at the bottom right, but that they might commit violence against their owners, poison them, slit their throats at night. There was all kinds of anxiety and fear that white Virginians were constantly living with in this time. Now, Dunmore eventually is forced to flee Williamsburg. He ends up in Norfolk, and this is a really important piece of the story that often gets overlooked. Norfolk was actually 3 times larger than Williamsburg. It was the only city in Virginia, and it had become a very prosperous port. It's becoming an important node in the British Empire. And it had factories, distilleries, mills, shipyards, you name it. It was a very cosmopolitan place. It also had a very skilled Black workforce. Though most were enslaved, they nevertheless lived in a very different kind of slavery than those who worked on distant plantations in other parts of the Commonwealth. And this is important because Dunmore's decision to go to the port of Norfolk put him in a place where not only were there Black workers who were likely to support him, but there also were Scottish merchants who could pay him, who could actually loan him money so he could continue the fight against this rebellion. So in the summer and fall of 1775, enslaved Africans from across the colony began to flock to Gosport, which is a shipyard just downstream from Norfolk in the Elizabeth River. It was owned by a Scottish merchant. So this became kind of the headquarters for the opposition to the rebellion. And it was really enslaved Black people who took enormous risks, I mean, risking torture, imprisonment, and death in order to reach British lines in the hope that they might find liberty of some sort. Now, things heated up in October of 1775. So remember, the war begun in Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, virtually at the same time that the powder magazine incident occurred in Williamsburg. But unlike in Massachusetts, where the fight was over gunpowder, in Virginia, the first bloodshed was over an enslaved man. His name was Joseph Harris. He was a pilot. Many enslaved Africans were pilots in Virginia at that time. It was a very important and a role that required, a good deal of responsibility. You're actually taking ships in and out of the harbor and out of Chesapeake Bay. So he joined the British, infuriating the Patriots, who demanded his return. Now, the British said, no way, we're not giving this person up. They knew what would happen to him if he returned over to the Patriots. Under Virginia law, he could be executed. So when this war of words turned into a war of bullets, the British attacked Hampton in October. They were forced to withdraw, and Thomas Jefferson then said, Lord Dunmore has commenced hostilities in Virginia. It has raised our country into a perfect frenzy, giving me that wonderful title. Now, a month later, there was another clash. It was a smaller clash at a place called Kemp's Landing, what's now Virginia Beach. in this clash, the British, along with black and white loyalists, were marching through a swamp. They were ambushed by a group of local patriots who outnumbered the British, but they fired too soon, and Dunmore was able to beat back this assault. And what happened during that battle is very important. There was a militia leader, the Patriot militia leader, was captured, and he was captured by the man who had previously owned him. This obviously impressed Dunmore, and that day he issued the proclamation, and the first Emancipation Proclamation in British North America, that freed anyone who was willing to fight for the king. This was a very, very radical move, as radical as the Declaration of Independence would be. It was the first time that a senior British official had offered emancipation to large numbers of enslaved people. And people came. They came from as far away as Massachusetts and New Jersey. They came to the Norfolk area seeking freedom. So the initial Ethiopian regiment that was created involved maybe 200 to 300 black volunteers, and they were said by the Patriots to have stitched the motto, "Liberty to Slaves," on their uniforms. Now, we don't know if that's true for sure, but it seems quite likely that this was a response to the liberty or death phrase that Patrick Henry had used the previous March. This was the first Black Corps in the British Army. And let's talk about the name. So first of all, it's Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. He gave it his personal name. And Ethiopian at the time was a term of respect, maybe one of the only terms of respect that Europeans used when referring to Africans. Ethiopia was a Christian country, considered to be a place of great wealth and intellect, and so Ethiopians were viewed highly in Europe, even though most of the Virginia enslaved people came from Western Africa, far away. Nevertheless, this again shows that Dunmore was seeing these people not just as cannon fire, but he was seeing them with a measure of respect. He also gave them arms. Later British generals who offered emancipation did not give arms to black men. So this is an important distinction that we have to keep in mind. Now, the Patriots panicked. In the wake of this emancipation, there was fear up and down the East Coast. Washington himself said that if Dunmore was not instantly crushed, he will become the most formidable enemy America has. And he specifically meant that if enough black men went to fight with Dunmore, that the Patriots would be overwhelmed. So part of the effort to stop the flight of blacks to Dunmore was a campaign to denigrate him. You know, he was called a liar, a cheat, a rapist, a drunkard. They really threw everything in the book that they could at Dunmore in order to destroy his reputation among whites as well as among blacks. And one Virginia patriot, John Page, said, "Be not ye Negroes tempted by this proclamation," citing the baseness of Lord Dunmore's heart, his malice and treachery. So you can see the desperation that the Patriots felt when suddenly they were facing a rebellion by their own enslaved people. At that point, a Patriot army began its march from Williamsburg to Norfolk. And this came to a head at Great Bridge, which is just south of Norfolk. It's an important crossing point where a bridge crosses the Elizabeth. It's the gateway into the Norfolk area. And in the course of this battle, it was actually a series of battles that took place over a week. Black and white American soldiers actually came into conflict for the first time. And in a couple of instances, the black soldiers overwhelmed the whites, but in other instances, the Patriots beat the Ethiopian regiment. In the end, there was a terrible fight in which the British and the black and white loyalists were defeated. The British and loyalist forces then had to retreat to Norfolk. There was no easy way to defend the town, so they got on board ships in the harbor, and the Patriots flooded into Norfolk in the middle of December of 1775. Now, you all may be aware of the burning of Norfolk. I won't go into detail, but Norfolk was burned. Dunmore was blamed. It was actually the Patriots we know in retrospect who actually did the burning. And it served the Patriots well because, as Washington himself said, it would push Americans to accept the propriety of separation. In other words, if the British are burning our homes and our towns, then we might as well join the Patriot cause. So in the course of this time from December of 1775 to August of 1776, Lord Dunmore and this flotilla made for a great threat to Virginia's patriots at a time when the other colonies were debating whether or not independence was a good thing or not. Uh, you had thousands of people, as many as 3,000 people, black and white, living on these watercraft throughout the winter. And then in just before spring, in February, Dunmore created a base, what is today Hospital Point in Portsmouth, and he created a fort that proved to be quite sturdy. He said, we have four ovens and pretty good barracks for our Ethiopian Corps. So he was actively, even after the defeat of Great Bridge, encouraging people to come, drilling them, arming them, giving them uniforms, and preparing them for what he hoped would be an attack on Williamsburg in the spring of 1776. These were not desperate people. This was a very organized force which the American patriots failed to dislodge. What dislodged them ultimately from the Norfolk Harbor area was smallpox. They decided that the black soldiers needed to be inoculated. To do that, you're going to be sick potentially for a week or two, exposing yourself to the patriots. So everybody moved up to Gwynn's Island along Chesapeake Bay. Enslaved people continued to arrive despite the fact that people were dropping like flies from typhus and other diseases, more so than even smallpox. And on July 9th, the Patriots attacked Dunmore's fleet and managed to force their departure. This is, of course, just days after the Declaration was signed in Philadelphia. So by mid-August, Dunmore and the Ethiopian Regiment are forced to retreat to New York. These black soldiers, unlike what Thomas Jefferson claimed that they were all sold to the West Indies, in fact, were taken to New York, where they fought in the Battle of Long Island that took place soon after. So just to wrap up, and we can get to questions, what's really important about this brief period in American history is the ripples that it created. Dunmore's proclamation forced George Washington, who had refused to allow black men in his army, to accept them in the Continental Forces. He made this decision just days after finding out about the emancipation, so the connection is clear. And as I mentioned, British generals followed Dunmore's lead in the years that followed, and thousands of enslaved people were freed, although very few were actually given arms. But this all went sour when Americans managed to insert into the Treaty of Paris with Britain the Article 7, that said that the British had to return all Negroes. It doesn't say enslaved people, all Negroes and other American property to the Patriots. Fortunately, there were some British officials who felt that this was a terrible thing to do, since the British had already freed thousands of enslaved people. So they quietly evacuated thousands of enslaved Africans, including many from Virginia and from Norfolk in particular, to Nova Scotia. Some went to Australia, Germany, England, but the bulk of them ended up in Nova Scotia, where many went on, many members of the Ethiopian Regiment went on to found by the British as a refuge for those enslaved people who had been freed. So ultimately, and I, of course, go into more detail in the book, I believe that Dunmore's decree, which was created because of the pressure imposed by enslaved people who showed up at his door, really helped to seed the abolitionist movement, both in Britain and in the United States. Although, of course, it took longer in the US for those who were enslaved to be free. By the 1830s and 40s, the British Empire had emancipated their enslaved people. So it's, I think, very important for us to keep in mind that the Revolution, the Civil War, are in so many ways connected, and that the Civil War, in a sense, was a completion of a war in which Dunmore had attempted to emancipate those people who were enslaved. So with that, we can get to some questions. Just a point, there is still a Dunmore Street in Norfolk, Virginia, which is a bit of a surprise, but it's still there.
Thank you, Andrew. And that, it's so fascinating. Obviously, I can't get the Norfolk pronunciation quite right because I'm not a native, but coming from that area, you obviously have a really different perspective than a lot of people who Growing up in New Jersey, we didn't hear a lot about this early part of the Revolution in Virginia. It was kind of, oh, Massachusetts, Boston Tea Party. What was, even as a native, what was the most surprising thing you found in your research for this book?
Well, two things. First of all, that the villain of my childhood had emancipated Black people. It had been omitted from the textbooks I had read, and I grew up in Norfolk with a very history-minded family. The other piece was the discovery that it was the Patriots who had burned their own city to the ground. And that was particularly shocking because when I was a child, my grandparents would take me to St. Paul's Church downtown, where we would look at the cannonball that was wedged into the wall of this Anglican church. And there was proof. There was a sign that said, fired by Lord Dunmore, January 1st, 1776. So I grew up believing that that Dunmore had committed, atrocities against my hometown and against my home state, when in fact, the more I dug, the more I realized that he was the victim of this very sophisticated propaganda campaign that used lots of racist tropes, and that the Patriots had really wanted to destroy the city because it was a place where the races were mixing, as well as a place where Scottish merchants were making money, and that had a kind of a cosmopolitan air that really went against the desires of people like Jefferson, who of course wanted foresaw in America that it would be a rural place with good farmers rather than capitalist cities. So these things were shocking to me because I thought I knew my history, and I realized there was a lot more to learn.
And a lot of this has only become more, I think, apparent in the past couple of years as people have dug into this history a little more thoroughly. I did drop in the chat a link to our entry on the burning of Norfolk, which talks about what was a very successful propaganda campaign on the part of the Patriots, which for good reason, they wanted to win a war, and that made sense for them to do that. Talk a little bit about, again, from the Virginia perspective, a lot of people in Virginia were reluctant to go full-fledged against the crown, to full-fledged enter the war. How important that this proclamation was, and how it really was a bit of a flip switch in this most populous colony. Again, the attention is often towards the Sons of Liberty in Boston and Massachusetts, but really, how did Virginia drive entrance into the Revolution in a lot of ways?
When I was growing up, I never quite understood why these wealthy conservative planters would want to fight the British Empire when they were so vulnerable. But as I did the research, I began to understand that it was really this desire for land in the West that was critical. As I mentioned, people like Washington were land speculators, and they saw themselves making, their next big fortune was going to be made on this land that was owned by indigenous people. And the only thing standing between them and that wealth was King George III, who had said, no, white people stay to the east, the Indians are to the west, and we don't want the two of you getting into an expensive war that I will have to pay for. So this really was such an important motivator. And of course, in order to cultivate that land, they would need more enslaved people. So there was a great fear in Virginia that the British would begin to put restrictions on slavery, particularly with the freeing of James Somerset that I mentioned. So all of these things also come back to one thing, and that is guns. And this is something that I think we really need to understand, particularly in today's debate about gun control. And that is that in Virginia, in the colonial period, what stood between you as the white owner of enslaved people and your enslaved people was your gun. For the most part, there wasn't much of a militia or even, slave patrols on a regular basis. You really were responsible for keeping your people in bondage from committing violence or running away. That was your job, even though there were lots of laws that punished people who did do that. And so the guns, the presence of guns really had little to do by that point, with hunting or with Indians, because the vast majority of Virginians lived in areas where there weren't many indigenous people left. they weren't much of a threat, and where a lot of the animals were gone. So really, the guns were critical. So when Patrick Henry realized that a lot of white farmers were not interested in joining the revolution, he said to a friend, this is right after Dunmore has taken the powder, he says, you can talk to the people about taxes and tariffs, but these notions are too abstract for them to understand. But if you tell them that first they came for your powder, next they're coming for your guns, and they will flock to your cause. And sure enough, Dunmore's threat to free the slaves and Patrick Henry's claim, which was untrue, that the British intended to disarm individual white Virginians, really caused a lot of people to think twice and to join the militia. And that really added fire to what had been really not a revolution at that point, just an incipient rebellion.
And someone asks, that the burning of Norfolk by the Patriots seems paradoxical because it deprived the Patriots of booming town and economy. But why did they not particularly want that town, or that town especially, to prosper?
Well, if you think about the current split in this country between cities and rural areas, I think you can understand what was going on in Virginia in 1775. So Virginia was largely an economy of enslaved people working the land and small white farmers. Norfolk was an outlier. It was not the capital. The capital was in Williamsburg, a very small town that didn't have a lot of economic power. Norfolk was a booming place where people were mixing, where capitalism was beginning to happen thanks to these Scottish merchants. And this really rubbed the Patriot leaders, who were mostly conservative planters, the wrong way. They never liked Norfolk from the beginning because they didn't trust a city. They couldn't quite control Norfolk in the way that they could control their plantations. So over the decades, if you look at the development of the city and its relationship with the colony, you see that there were constraints put on the city and a lot of antipathy that was aimed at Norfolk even before the Revolution. When the Revolution starts to happen, Scottish merchants are seen as a fifth column. They're seen as dangerous pro-British people who want to keep their trade and have no interest in gaining independence. You have Black people who were considered more rebellious and were more literate and were more powerful in many ways than those who were scattered over these forced labor plantations. And finally, you have, as I mentioned, people like Jefferson, who were really suspicious of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And they really did not want the colony to go down the path of being a place of large cities. So in some ways, the destruction of Norfolk was an effort to snuff out what, of course, became the future. And as a result, Virginia lagged behind economically after the war more than any other state. Imagine if Charleston or New York or Philadelphia or Boston had been flattened, it would have had a huge impact. So without Norfolk, without a port that was really tied to the rest of the world, Virginia lapsed into depression. It lapsed into, into becoming an economic backwater from which the state really did not come out of until long after the Civil War.
Now, someone is also interested in knowing, during this period of enlisting enslaved people to fight for the British, what was happening with the indigenous people in the region?
Oh, great question. I didn't get into that, but one of the most exciting stories that I uncovered, which some of you may have heard of, is that Lord Dunmore tried to incite a rebellion among the indigenous people in the Ohio Valley, people that he had fought just a year or two before. His goal was this. It was to get the British who were in Detroit to send out troops long way away from Virginia, but to march through that area, through the Ohio Valley, and to get indigenous people to flock to their side, because indigenous people were terrified that these white patriots were going to overwhelm them. As soon as the British took the brakes off, they were going to flood over the Appalachian Mountains. So Dunmore was very clever in thinking that he could get the Shawnees and other peoples to fight for the British. And their plan actually was to invade Virginia from the west. And then in the spring of 1776, they would come over the mountains, they would come down the Potomac Valley, past Mount Vernon, and they would meet up in Alexandria, Virginia, with Dunmore's fleet, and thereby crushing the rebellion. And Dunmore intended to be back in Williamsburg by, say, the summer of 1776. It didn't work out, but it shows that the indigenous people played a really important part in both sides jockeying to get their support. For the most part, the indigenous folks said, we're going to sit this out, with some large exceptions, because they realized that if they bet on the wrong horse, then they were sunk.
And I did drop in our chat our newest entry on the 7 Years' War in Virginia, which also talks about the fact that for most of these wars, you had three powers at play. You had the French, the British, and the indigenous nations. And then during the Revolution as well, there was the indigenous nations played a large role in both diplomacy and in direct fighting in some cases. Someone wants to know if you can elaborate more about the abolitionist movement after the Revolutionary War, such as the various activities that connected it to gradual anticipation in the North, which, as you know, happened more quickly in the North than it did in the South.
Well, this is one of the great tragedies of the American Revolution, is that in its aftermath, in the decades that followed, the slave codes became much, much harsher. The Patriots, then, who were in control of Virginia's government, began to make it more difficult to become emancipated. If you were freed, you had to leave the state after a certain point. It really became much more of a tougher environment for those people who were enslaved. Now, this wasn't true in the North, because you mentioned the North went in a different direction. Pennsylvania and some other states actually began the process of emancipation, often very limited, often, in the next 10 years, we'll do this and this. But nevertheless, it was definitely putting those people who were enslaved, giving them hope at least that life might get better for, say, the next generation. In Virginia, this was not the case. And this is one of the great scandals, I think, of the American Revolution, is that some 10,000 people, many of them Virginian, were forced to emigrate from their own country in order to secure their freedom. So these thousands of people who were evacuated from Charleston, Savannah, probably many from Chesapeake Bay, and then from New York City to other places in the British Empire, I think this is the first great American diaspora that's never really been talked about in great detail. And it really shows that these were people who were desperate for freedom and were willing to leave their home country for ports unknown in order to maintain the freedom that the British had provided them during the war.
That's a good segue to our next question. What happened to the Ethiopian Regiment after it went to New York? Was it disbanded or kept as a segregated unit throughout the rest of the war?
So the Ethiopian Regiment, by the time it got to New York, of course, so many had died of disease, but there were still, a good number of men. We don't know precisely how many members there were in the regiment. We don't have, the records are very sparse. We have some individual names of people who joined. There are some famous people who were members. Harry Washington was owned by George Washington and had left probably in 1776 to join Lord Dunmore. He actually went on to fight in Charleston for the Royal Artillery. Then he managed to get to New York as the war is coming to an end. Then he manages to get to Nova Scotia to secure his freedom. And then when life is bad in Nova Scotia, he ends up going with 1,000 or more formerly enslaved people to Sierra Leone, where he fomented a rebellion against a British government that he viewed as being tyrannical. So this man alone has such an interesting life. He is one member of the Ethiopian Regiment. Most of them ended up in 1776 in New York. They were absorbed into the British Army. Most of them became members of what was known as the Black Pioneers. Now, the Black Pioneers was created after the Ethiopian Regiment had been created by General Clinton when he was invading the South in the spring of 1776. And probably Clinton got this idea from Dunmore because he actually visited Dunmore in the harbor there and certainly witnessed members and met members of the Ethiopian Regiment. So he was primed to think that, maybe we could use black men in the struggle. Now, Clinton was more conservative. He would not give guns to these men. The black pioneers were engineers. That is, they dug trenches. They helped do the hard work necessary to create fortifications. Uh, Now, many of them stayed in New York after 1776, where they had various tasks. The Black Pioneers were used throughout the war, particularly in the North, and were really it's a very large and important piece of the Black participation in the American Revolution. We don't know specifically how many members of the Ethiopian Regiment who had joined the Black Pioneers then went on to places like Nova Scotia, but it seems like many did, and many took their families. And this is an interesting detail that a lot of people who fled to Lord Dunmore, these weren't just black men who said, I want to fight for the king. Men, women, and children of all ages came to Norfolk and its environs in that time. And Dunmore clearly had black families on his flotilla, and many of them went to New York. So I think this is just an important detail that these weren't just soldiers. These were soldiers who were traveling for the most part with their families, whether it was brothers, sisters, children, wives. So it was really a whole society that was moving from Norfolk to Gwynn's Island to New York, and then later to Nova Scotia.
And someone else wants to know what happened to Lord Dunmore after the war.
Well, it's a great question. I thought I'd do like all other historians have done and end my story when Dunmore leaves Chesapeake Bay in August of 1776, right? Okay, he's done. It's over. The regiment is decimated. A few people go to New York, but I thought that was it. Well, I was really wrong. Dunmore stayed in New York and clearly made sure that the regiment was absorbed into the British Army. I'm quite sure that he had a big say in that. Then he tried to get a commission in the army. They said, no, you're a governor. You got to go back to Britain. He goes back to Britain, but he doesn't just go back to his country house. He actually really, hectors the king to release enslaved people so that they could fight. He said, the only way we're going to win this war is by emancipating enslaved people. And this was not a message that a lot of British were interested in hearing, because many of them, of course, had interests in the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, where they were enslaving people. So this was a threat to their way of life. But Dunmore just kept pushing. And in 1781, thinking that Cornwallis was going to win, he arrived in Charleston. And his plan was to go to Williamsburg, take over his old job. Well, of course, we know Cornwallis, he learned that Cornwallis had actually been defeated by Washington at Yorktown. Nevertheless, Dunmore then goes to the British authorities and says, I got a great plan. We're going to raise an army of 10,000 enslaved people, and we're going to march to Virginia, and we're going to take Williamsburg. I mean, it was breathtaking in its ambition. Now, what's interesting is that Dunmore wanted to ensure that these people were well paid. He wanted promises that they would in fact be freed, and he wanted them to be officers if they proved worthy. These were really significant concessions, one could say, for a man of that time. Later, of course, we know that the British said, we're throwing in the towel. So Dunmore goes back to Britain, and then he's appointed to be governor of the Bahamas, right off the coast of Florida. And there he has a mixed record. He bought enslaved people there, and he had plantations. And at the same time, he set up a court to adjudicate the disputes brought by enslaved people who said they had been wrongly enslaved, that actually they had been freed in America, and that these loyalists, white loyalists, had come to the Bahamas and brought them illegally. So, he again was seen as somebody who was supporting the emancipation of enslaved people, although again, as a slave owner, a very complex figure. He was recalled to Britain, not because of this controversy, but because his daughter decided to secretly marry a son of King George III. The furious king called Dunmore back. Dunmore's family was basically excommunicated from the British elite, and he and his wife, Lady Dunmore, and their kids were forced to, they were basically forced out of British society, and they ended up living out their days in a small seaside town in southeastern England, where Dunmore died in 1809. By the way, 2 weeks, I think, before Abraham Lincoln was born. So again, there's this continuity that Dunmore was really pushing for emancipation well, even after the war was over. And we know that Abraham Lincoln used his proclamation as basically as a legal precedent for him to issue his own more famous Emancipation Proclamation in 1863.
But very similar in that it was only freeing the enslaved people of the people who were in rebellion against them, not everybody. So he clearly modeled that on Dunmore, because Dunmore's proclamation only freed people who were fighting against the king. It did not free people who were enslaved by loyalists.
And this is an important point because people, historians in the past traditionally have said, well, Dunmore really wasn't interested in, wasn't doing this for moral reasons. He simply was doing it to get soldiers. Well, that was the same criticism that was aimed at Abraham Lincoln by Southerners in 1863. They said he's not interested in these people. He just wants soldiers. So I think we have to keep in mind that these men were both politicians. They both were dealing with a very complicated and volatile environment, and that while it might have been nice to say, let's free everybody, they really had to toe the line so that they could do something that would be effective rather than something that would hurt their cause. This doesn't justify slavery, of course, or the lack of a full emancipation, but it does put it into important context. So I think Dunmore, while I don't believe that at the time he had interest in mass emancipation, I think he really evolves over the years. You know, he's working and living and fighting with Black men, and he sees them clearly as good soldiers. He encourages them. He uses respectful terms. In fact, when some of them, when many die in an epidemic, he says, "I've lost many fine fellows." You know, these are not that's not a phrase that would have been used by many white Americans of that day. So I think Dunmore over time sees that these men are great fighters. And I think the reason behind that is that he was a Scottish Highlander. And the Scottish Highlanders of that time were treated by many English as barbaric drunkards who really were living on the edge of civilization. They were seen in some ways like many whites saw Black people. So I think he understood that nature of prejudice, and he was judging people over time by their actions rather than their color.
And you know, it's always fun, I think, with history to play a little bit of a what if kind of game. You know, his force is decimated by smallpox and other diseases, you say, but if it hadn't been, he would have had what, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 capable soldiers. I mean, how would have if they had been able to suppress the rebellion in Virginia, which Dunmore did keep warning his superiors was as dangerous as the rebellion in Massachusetts, how might have things looked different?
Yeah, and this was one of the great surprises in my research is really grasping how ill-equipped and disorganized and how much infighting was happening among the Virginia Patriots. You know, these people really did not have their act together. Patrick Henry was made commander of Virginia's forces in 1775, and he had no military experience. He didn't understand logistics. Unlike Washington, he didn't get that blankets were just as important as military tactics. So he proved to be a bit of a disaster and had to and resigned ultimately in 1776. There were more competent commanders, but largely there was so much infighting that Dunmore understood that he really had an opportunity to take advantage of the chaos in Virginia to take back control. Because a lot of people were tired of the chaos, and a lot of patriots were split, you know, those who supported Patrick Henry versus those who supported the more conservative people. So there were all kinds of rifts that the governor could have exploited. And having 3,000 to 4,000 men, which is certainly would have been reasonable had disease not decimated them, I think that there's little question that they could have wreaked havoc on the Patriot forces given time. Remember, that when Dunmore has that base at Tucker's Mill Point, Hospital Point in Portsmouth, the Patriots tried for months to overcome that fort, and they were unable to. Charles Lee, Washington's #2 in command, is sent down specifically to take care of Dunmore, and he can't do anything. They simply don't have the armaments or the wherewithal to be able to do more than burn more houses of innocent civilians, just out of pure spite. So the Patriots really didn't know what to do. And I think it's important to know this because in the spring of 1775, there was so much fear and anxiety about what Dunmore could do that this helped push Virginians to vote unanimously in Williamsburg on May 15th, 1776, not only to break from Britain, but to tell the Continental Congress that it should do the same. So this threat from Dunmore, I think, really helped to ultimately to pull together the opposition toward Britain, and that in turn helped to birth a nation.
That and it always those very ironic ways that wars turn out. Of course, sometimes you cannot predict just looking at the force strengths. We have someone who wants to know, and this is a great question, considering that we're going to be celebrating the semi-Q, as we call it, because it's too hard to say the whole word, in 2026. You know, how do you view the Ethiopian Regiment as part of the fight for American independence?
Well, you know, when I was 10 years old and Lord Dunmore was the villain of my childhood, you know, it's kind of appropriate. We had villains and we have heroes when we're young. Those are how stories are told. I think now that we're 250, I think it's time for us to have a more sophisticated take on the American Revolution. The members of the Ethiopian Regiment had put themselves into a far more perilous situation than any white Virginian at that time. If you were an Ethiopian Regiment member and you were captured by the Patriots, you were not treated as a prisoner of war. You were sent either to the jail in Williamsburg, which was notorious as a place from which many people did not step out of, or you were sent to the lead mines in Western Virginia, a kind of Appalachian gulag. So, you know, I have such respect for people who took enormous risks, who really did risk their lives for liberty in order to just begin the process of fighting in order to get their liberty. And I think that now we're old enough as a country to be able to hold both the Minutemen who were at Lexington and Concord and the Ethiopian Regiment soldiers as people to respect, as those who risked their lives for freedom, risked their lives to be able to live their lives as they wanted to without being tyrannized by anyone else. And you know, that is the concept, I think, behind this nation's founding that certainly transcends, I think, the color of the coat that people were wearing at the time.
And it does give, I think it is hopeful too that they did go to New York, that the regiment ended up fighting in New York. And perhaps some of those emancipation movements in the North did come from people being able to see those people and fight alongside of them. As you
Absolutely.
said,
And in Britain, don't forget in Britain too. In Britain, you know, people knew that these people had fought, and there were many who went to England. So for the first time, you know, the British people, I think, also realized, oh, you know, black people as soldiers. And so the idea of emancipation became easier to grasp. And then, of course, on this side, not just in the North, but in Virginia, there were veterans who had fought for the Patriots, black veterans, many of whom did not receive the freedom they were promised, but some did. But the point is that the presence of these black veterans on both sides, I think, showed a different aspect to those of African heritage than whites had been willing to see before. You really couldn't ignore the fact that these people had been willing to lay down their lives for a cause, and therefore should be at least provided with basic freedoms.
and of course, in Virginia, the legislature selectively emancipates people for their bravery, but not in a more global sense, which is obviously a certain blindness to that.
Yeah.
We have one last comment. Someone just wants to comment that there's also a Lord Dunmore Drive in Virginia Beach near
Ah,
Kent's Landing. So that's very appropriate.
yes. In fact, I was just there giving a talk in Virginia Beach, and someone said I live on Lord Dunmore Drive, and
That is funny. And
and
yeah,
what's sad is that we actually don't know the place where the Emancipation Proclamation was decreed. We don't know exactly where Dunmore was, just the general area. So I hope that there could be some more research done into that, which could give us an idea and a place that we can celebrate as an
would be a
important
great
spot.
marker, a great historical marker. Yeah, it would be. Well, I think that's probably about it for today. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's a fascinating time and a fascinating subject, and we could just talk about it all day. I will point you to Andrew's website, andrewlawler.com, for more information about Andrew. You can buy Perfect Frenzy at your favorite independent bookstore, and I think Andrew also has a list of booksellers on his website as well. Let me drop that into the chat for anybody who wants that. And thanks everyone for coming today. Oops. And if you would like to keep up to date on Encyclopedia Virginia and all our newest entries, we do actually have an entry coming up on the lead mines in Austinville, which, as Andrew said, are a really undertold part of the story of the Revolution, that the folks who were recaptured mostly from fleeing from slavery were sent to labor there. Many did not leave there. Again, very little understood part of revolutionary history. That's coming up. So subscribe to our newsletter so you can keep up to date on all our cool new entries coming out. And I will just give one last little plea. If you found today's event valuable, please consider becoming a supporter of Encyclopedia Virginia so you can keep us free and online for everyone. And we'll thank Andrew one more time. And thank you everyone today for participating and for your great questions. Please join us next time. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.